Welcome to MANstream Media Weekly, a place where you get the male-friendly perspective on both the news, the issues, no matter how late we are. And yes, we're late tonight. Sorry, gentlemen and ladies, we're a little bit late. In fact, we've been tardy the past week, too. We're going to do our best to be on time from now on and also try and be there every week. So my apologies for that. Tonight, we have with us myself, Tom Golden, and two of the gentlemen I most admire, Paul Elam from A Voice for Men. Paul?
Hello, everybody.
And Warren Farrell out in San Francisco.
Hi there.
Hey, Warren. Tonight we're going to talk about domestic violence. We're going to talk about domestic violence from a certain perspective, and that is the perspective of the White Ribbon Campaign. Because there have been some really interesting things that have happened with this White Ribbon in the past couple of weeks. And Paul, maybe you can start us out.
Well, yeah, let's first just take an overview. White Ribbon Campaign is actually a feminist initiative that is operating right now out of Australia, the UK, and Canada, I believe. It is I'm going to use the word typical feminist operation in that it views domestic violence itself, defines it in terms of patriarchy theory, which is to say that domestic violence is described and explained by a system of male dominance extended into the home. That is what the Duluth model is based on. This is how most battered women's shelters operate. The VAWA is founded on this sort of ideology about domestic violence, and it paints predominantly men as perpetrators, and according to patriarchy theory, it can only be men that are perpetrators and only be women that are victims. However, there is a huge amount of research in terms of surveys, empirical studies, and the like that point a lot more toward gender symmetry in domestic violence, or roughly that men and women engage in mutual combat a lot, and men and women hit or attack each other physically at roughly equal rates. Now that varies depending on whether or not the violence is reciprocated. In unreciprocated violence, one-directional violence, the CDC has found that 70% of that is perpetrated by women. But here we now have the White Ribbon Campaign, whose objective it is, and I'm afraid I'm going to put that in scare quotes, to raise awareness about domestic violence by issuing white ribbons and by asking men to take a pledge to end violence against women. Ostensibly a noble cause. Certainly there is nothing wrong with the idea of men not hitting women. However, what happens to the remaining people that are part of the intimate partner cycle? The children of those families where the mothers are violent, the relationships where it is in fact the woman that is either instigating or perpetrating the majority of violence. This is something that White Ribbon Campaign does not address, and in fact, by their very model, minimizes and denies. There's a huge problem with that, and I can tell you as somebody with clinical experience that in dealing with populations that had problems with addictions, with alcoholism and drug abuse, that this was a population that had a high incidence of violence compared to the general population. There was lots and lots of violence in those families. And in working with those families, what I found was that the adults there were not near as traumatized by the violence in the home as the children. I could talk to adults about the violence in the home, and they could recount the facts rather coldly. Many of them admitted to being in mutual combat, that it was an escalating thing that happened, that it was tied to drug abuse and other factors in the home. But when I talked to the children in violent households, we found that they worried constantly about what was happening with their parents, when their family was going to break up. They were losing sleep. It was affecting their schoolwork. They were acting out the violence. They may witness violence in the home and then go to school and act it out on somebody else. Or they may grow up and get into relationships where they're either perpetrators of violence because they've had that modeled in the home growing up, or where they repeat the cycle and become victims of violence again. A model that only recognizes half of the violence that's going on is in effect ignoring half of the victims and probably more when you start considering the children that are in those homes. So on its surface, a program that just says, let's end violence against women, is saying, let's also ignore violence that's happening in the home to men and to their children that are witnessing it. One of the most tragic things that can happen out of this is that you have men that are faced with almost impossible decisions. Men that are victims of violence in the home sometimes face the choice that they could either stay in the home and continue to be abused, or they can leave and leave their children in the care of an abuser and unprotected. If you can imagine the weight of that kind of decision on somebody, and what they see when they go looking for help, as Denise Hines found out in some of her research, is that there's virtually nothing available to them, that they're laughed out of many service providers, that they're told they can get for their violence, or even the stereotypical of what we would expect for happen to women in the 1950s. The men will be asked, you know, what did you do to make her be angry? What did you do to cause this to happen? This is the paradigm that we're operating in right now, and unfortunately there is a lot of people that suffer for it, and including ultimately young girls that grow up and get involved in violent relationships. Ignoring half the problem perpetuates half the problem. We're creating more abusers, and we're creating more abuse victims with this paradigm, and it is time to bring that to a stop.
Amen to that. Well said. Well said. Warren, what are you thinking?
Well, a lot of things. I've done a huge amount of research on this, and the first thing that I discovered when I did the research for the myth of male power was that there were 12 legal defenses that women could use to exonerate themselves from domestic violence when they were accused of it, none of which was available to men. So since we're supposed to be in a constitutional society where we have equal protection of the laws for both sexes, really all 12 of those defenses are illegal, but they are still on the books. The learned helplessness defense, or the battered woman syndrome, is really that Lenore Walker sort of instigated, is the most common of those, which says that, you know, when a woman is violent, it's because very frequently she has learned to be helpless, and in the final analysis she explodes to kill the man in the middle of the night because she feels she's so been persuaded by his helplessness, by becoming helpless as he's a dominant force, that she has no option but to kill him in the middle of the night. But when the situation is reversed, where the evidence shows that the male has been very much, the woman has been the dominant force, and the male responds by killing the woman, that has not ever been able to be used as part of the learned helplessness defense in reverse. We see sort of an innocent woman defense, where when a woman like Bessie, there's a woman named Bessie Richardson, and she had Bessie Reese, Bessie Reese, who had been killed, who had killed 7 children of a fellow named Richardson, and but she said that she had not done that, and her husband, the father.
Warren, you with us?
The children's death sentence was commuted in Texas, and as a result of that, there were more years that expired, and Bessie Reese eventually said, "I was the one that did the killing." When she said that she was the one that did the killing, she was not believed, and so that the innocent woman defense is a defense that a woman is believed when she says that she's innocent, but she is not believed when she says that she is guilty. And this happens, and there's many examples of that are woven throughout the legal system. So, but that all does not seem so outrageous if you come from the patriarchal model that Paul was describing, which is that there's no way that a woman can, that acts of violence are inherently by the powerful group toward the less powerful group, and when the less powerful group responds and kills the more powerful group, that's only a matter of learned helplessness. That's where that learned helplessness theory comes from. So now let's compare that. That's the law. Compare that to the reality. And the reality is that Marty Fiebert has done a bibliography of more than 120 now studies of men and women engaged in domestic violence. This is from high school and college dating all the way up to men and women who have killed each other. And he finds that, and almost every one of those domestic violence studies, the larger ones in particular, find that women are violent toward men at every level of violence. Now, every level of violence, what I mean by that is the slapping level, is the punching level, is the threatening with a knife or a gun level, the actual using a knife, the shooting with a gun on the partner. The only thing that seemed to be unclear, and the studies many of these studies have been done by women. Most of the women have been feminists. Some of the best ones initially were done by Murray Strauss and a fellow named Gellis. And these studies were, one after the other, was assumed to be flawed, which is why feminists went out to replicate and do a better version of the studies. But to the acknowledgement of, I acknowledge the feminist researchers for ultimately publishing studies that showed that in fact it was basically an equal opportunity phenomenon. So but when a woman, like let's say when we start the process in the early age, and like in you're dating, a woman and man are dating, and the woman slaps him for she's angry at him. And normally speaking, the response of the guy will be to accept the slap and not hit back. But sometimes if that slap is repeated or hard or often, the man will hit back, but then he's accused of domestic violence when he hits back. The previous assaults of him are not considered domestic violence. But by not considering that domestic violence, what we often get into is that a woman gets used to hitting a guy until it no longer becomes something acceptable to him, and he loses it, hits her back, and then he's arrested. But the process of not acknowledging that this can come from either sex, and it is a very important signal that something needs to be done about the communication process to stop this. By excusing it on her part, she becomes entitled, and people who are entitled continue to do what they feel entitled to do. So, and it avoids the solution to domestic violence. The concept that the women's movement has held forward, that men are almost always at fault and must admit that they are responsible before any progress can be made, completely misses what domestic violence is about. Domestic violence is usually an act of power designed to compensate for a deeper experience of powerlessness. So the solution is not getting men to be disempowered. The solution is getting both sexes to feel empowered. How does that happen? If Paul is, or if a guy is married to a woman and the woman says, I really was upset that you came in late last night and you seemed like you were drunk, you did, and the guy, the job of the guy is to learn how to listen to her in a way that empathizes with her feelings, whether or not she's accurate about the data. The job of a woman is to do exactly the same for a guy. When he's wrong about some accusation he makes to her, to be able to hear what he feels, what he is saying, and reflect back to him what she feels he is saying, until he agrees that that is an accurate version of what he's saying. That's the first step in the active listening process, and then that is required for men and women to learn how to communicate with each other in such a way that doesn't escalate the argument. That is the work that the Violence Against Women Act should be using its hundreds of millions of dollars to finance. Couples communication work all around the country, particularly in poorer and less educated areas where not even the semblance of good communication oftentimes exists. And that's what will eliminate, or not eliminate, but very greatly minimize domestic violence. We are wasting hundreds of millions of dollars, which is an opportunity cost that is lost. Thousands and thousands of women could not be battered if we were using that money to help both sexes communicate. And thousands and thousands of men could not be battered. And our school system could be teaching girls and boys when they first start dating how to communicate when they don't feel understood, and how to hear each other. That cuts the domestic violence propensity in the bud.
Yeah, that'd be a nice world, Warren. I like that idea. But unfortunately, the whole communication idea has been scrubbed, for the patriarchal Duluth model kind of ideas that basically push therapy and push communication ideas out the window. And I think what both you and Paul have described very well. Women are almost always the victims, and men are almost always the perpetrators. And this comes from every sphere. It comes from the activists themselves. It comes from the clinicians who are working with people. It comes from the media. It comes from the research people. It comes from the academics. All are saying the same thing, this one-sided story. I call it the Mobius strip of ideologies, because it's like it only has one side. No matter which way you look at it, there's only one side to this. And to me, this is absolutely incredibly amazing, that such a large issue to be so binary. I mean, it's just amazing to me. And one of the things that irks me the most is the research. Because the research, you would think that researchers would have a vested interest in getting the truth out. No matter if it's what their hypothesis says or not. It's like that's what the scientific method wants to do. You get the message out. And boy, the researchers just haven't fulfilled that at all. And if you look at Strauss's work on this, that beautiful piece that he wrote on the how the research has been, what would you say, how it's been focused only on the Duluth kind of model. I mean, he did a beautiful job in looking at the 7 things that he saw that kept that from happening. So, I guess a part of me is saying that we're just living in a culture that is crazy in some ways, because we're not seeing things clearly at all.
Tom, I really agree with that, and this is, it's a difficult conversation to have, but it's one that I think is incredibly necessary. I suggest that people go to avoiceformen.com and use the search bar for Murray Strauss. He was kind enough to give us permission to print his paper on there, which we have. And when you start looking at the level of corruption, academic corruption that is involved in diverting helpful, real information away from the public eye, the level of harassment. One of the things Warren could have mentioned and didn't is that Richard Gellis, Murray Strauss, Suzanne Steinmetz, all of these people received death threats and bomb threats when releasing information that indicated gender symmetry in intimate partner violence. When Erin Pitsey completed a lot of her research and found that many of the women that found service in her shelters were as violent or more violent than the men that they were running from. So many times when this comes up, there is corruption and coercion at every level. Careers have attempts there are attempts made to destroy careers, to deny tenure, to push people out, saying don't, study under this person. It's amazing that if the research does not fit the feminist narrative or the patriarchy-based theory of what domestic violence is, there is active effort, and this is, not subtle. This is going under our noses right now,
yes,
to destroy people doing that research, to destroy the research, to deep six it, to discredit it, because we're talking about money here, lots and lots and lots of it.
Yes, I'm doing a YouTube, it should be out in a couple of days, on a piece of domestic violence research. And it's amazing. The research came out in September, and it had headline after headline after headline. 1 in 5 men admits violence. It's like, wow, that's pretty impressive. So I contacted the researcher and I looked into the research and I literally found the data that he used. Guess what the data actually says? The data actually says that 1 in 4 women are violent against their spouse, and 1 in 5 men are violent against their spouse. But they only told the one side that said 1 in 5 men, and all these headlines came out, all these terrible men. But if you look at it, the women are saying much more often that they're violent. Amazing! It's absolutely mind-blowing.
That's first of all, I thought that was already produced, Tom. I've seen what you're talking about already, and it was brilliantly done, by the way.
Well, thank you. Actually, I've written the article. The article was up on my blog, but the YouTube hasn't been finished yet. And the YouTube's actually an abbreviated version of that article. But
it's really, really well done. I encourage everyone to look at that. The distinctions here that I see is that the research, there's been, as Fiebert pointed out, well, first of all, return of the death threats. The first time I published anything on domestic violence, it was in looking at the 12 legal defenses that women could use that men couldn't, and that was in the Myth of Male Power, and that got me death threats all over the place. And some that scared Liz and I when we were first dating, my wife and I, when we were first dating, because they would call at 1 o'clock in the morning, and she would, be with me, and it would be like really scary to get a phone call at that time of the morning. So anyway, the death threat aspect of things I can verify when you start talking about this issue. That really does happen. Second, there's an important distinction to be made, and you just sort of put your finger near it, which is that the research itself, the 100 and some odd 20 publications, there have been about 300 or 400 studies. Most of those studies cannot, almost all the studies find the same thing. They find that men and women batter each other about equally, usually, and that women acknowledge that they do more initiating and so on, like I said before. But most of those studies cannot get published in the academic journals. But about 125 or so have gotten published in those academic journals. They often have findings, just like we just talked about an equal amount of men and women doing the violence. However, so the academic research itself is not so bad. It is the translation of only the negative headlines, like you just talked about, looking at the part of where women are the victims. It is a translation from the research to the headlines that makes the popular press, and that plays into, and then the press that then calls up feminists for analyses and comments about that, and not people like ourselves who might choose to open up the entire article and say, wait a minute, there's a part of this article that you missed, because the entire dialogue about male-female issues is through the feminist community. And so then other reporters go to their favorite feminists at some local university, and they ask them their permission about it. And the feminists that have not done the studies do the same as the headliners do in the popular press. They have a philosophy that it's men that batter women, and that when women do batter men, it's always for a reason. But the moment you say that a man battered a woman for a reason, that is sexist to the core. And so it's an enormous double standard. And so, when I was asked today in an interview about the White Ribbon Campaign, I said, this is really crucial to bring this issue out in the discussion as a two-sex issue, because the moment it's a two-sex issue, then the therapeutic model has an opportunity to be used, and the active listening model, which is the best model that is available popularly, and the model that I've created to help people learn to handle personal criticism without becoming defensive, that is, to make it safe inside of the mind of the person hearing criticism to criticize with being loved, as opposed to go to the natural place that the brain goes to, which is when my partner criticizes me, I feel like they're killing me, and my job is to kill my partner before I kill my partner. That's the work that needs to be done, that is freed up to be done once the type of thing that we're talking about has enough credibility, so that it doesn't translate from the academic research to the headline with the distortion that you were talking about, Tom.
Yes, I agree 100%. And I think, Warren, that over the years, what I've noticed is the Duluth model people tend to look at the absolute worst case scenario with basically a terrorist as a man who's terrorizing the woman in multiple ways. Now, these people do exist, but they're a tiny percentage of what we're calling domestic violence. But they're treating all the cases as if they are like that, and that is the reason they say no therapy. Because really, you can't do therapy with someone who's a terrorist. I mean, that's just, I agree with them.
Every lawyer knows the expression, good cases make bad laws. And whenever you have a perfect case like this, and then you want to protect all the women that might be victims of somebody like that, or conversely, if you wanted to protect all the men that might be victims of a manipulative woman or a woman who has killed 3 or 4 husbands before that, and you make this enormous law protecting every man from every woman, you create a really screwed up and dangerous society.
Yes.
I think another thing that's also important about the misinformation is that it sort of creates a culture of ignorance about the nature of violence itself. We generally, when you think about it, as you go into poorer and poorer communities, what do you find? You find more violence. Why? Because violence is an expression of powerlessness, not of power. The more power people have, the less violent they tend to be. And we, on one level, don't have any problem understanding that. Now, that is not to justify that anybody without power should be excused in using violence. Certainly, just the opposite. People do need to be accountable. But the misinformation around domestic violence also feeds a sense of cultural ignorance about the nature of violence itself. When we think about it, though, if we go into very poor urban communities where we see a lot of violence, what do we also see there? We see poverty. We see people without power. And that's what people without power do. And until we come to understand that, and that's why Warren, what he was talking about is so important. Communication does empower people. It allows them to be heard. It gives them a place within the relationship where their needs matter. And when you have that, it's only common sense that you're going to have less acting out and less violence in order for people to say, I'm here, I have needs, I'm important, quit ignoring me. Because that's what the root of a lot of domestic violence is. It is a struggle to be heard.
So it's also, I think, very important that not only is it a misunderstanding of the nature of what motivates violence, it is also a fundamental, the belief that men have privilege and power, and therefore they feel perfectly okay about battering women, is the exact opposite of what masculinity is about.
No.
If I saw Tom hurting his wife or Paul hurting his wife, even though Paul is about 17 inches taller than I am, but just for fun and bigger, I would risk my life to make sure that Paul didn't hurt Stacy, because that's in me at a very deep level, is to make sure that no man hurts another man, and that if I love somebody, or even if I don't love somebody, if they're female, my job is to protect them, not to hurt them. I have never heard a feminist say that. I've never heard a feminist say, a leading feminist, say that the nature of masculinity is growing up to learn to protect women, not to harm women. The idea that men use their power to harm women, yes, some men do, but not purposely. They do it when they feel, at a moment that they feel powerless in a relationship. They are human beings who strike out, and there are some men who are drunk, and there are some men who are cruel, and there are some men who have been children of domestic violence who treat women like really terribly. And so there's exceptions to this rule, but when there are exceptions to this rule, that is masculinity broken down.
Yes.
That is not masculinity in the way we are trying to construct it. And so it is, but the feminist solution would never be, let's have masculinity constructively developed and absorbed by every boy. It would be to take the example of masculinity broken down and call that masculinity. That totally misses the point.
Yes. And
Very well put.
That's part of the wall that we face. And it is an amazing wall, too. I mean, when I go out and say something to people about male victims of domestic violence, it's like the people's faces are like, I mean, everyone has this sense that there's no such thing as a male victim of domestic violence.
And therefore, there must be something wrong with you for bringing it up.
Yeah. God, I remember when I was when I first got into all this was I had someone call me and said, "Can you take this client? This is a client who is possibly has domestic violence and he has to find a place for him and his kids." And I said, "Well, I don't know anything about domestic violence, but let me call around and see what's up." So I call the local domestic violence place and I tell them about this situation, and they tell me all the good things they can do for this person. And then we get to the point where I tell them, I didn't even think about it. I said, he's a guy, right? And they silence. Well, we can't help him. I said, what? And this whole thing was such a shock for me. I could not believe they were saying that. And so I called the next day. I called the head of this place, and I said, I talked with someone last night, and they said that you can't help men. Well, that's right. And so I went from there to the supervisor and went on, up until, the senators and the congressmen. And I got the same thing every place I went. It was like, no, you're crazy, Mr. Golden. You're crazy. So that really started me off. That pissed me off bad. When I saw what was happening, and saw a good sense of how men were being really shortchanged and blamed for something that was not their problem, that really pissed me off, and I've had fuel ever since then from that.
Yes.
And I want to go back for a second to something Warren said a minute ago about masculinity. That I was in clinical practice for about 20 years. The first 12 years of that, my identity was as a feminist. That is the worldview that I took. Yes, I know, shock of shocks. And what I found in working with these addicted people is, like I said, lots of violence. I never met a man who explained away his violence out of privilege. Not one. And I'm talking about dealing with many, 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 many people who have been in violent relationships going both ways. What I did find over and over and over again in working with men who had become violent in their relationships is that the way I reached them was through the shame they felt for being violent. And when we finally really started digging into the work, we found that all of them, to a man, felt like failures for having been violent toward their wives. They were deeply ashamed of it. There was a great amount of self-loathing there in that, and the fact that they felt like they did not measure up to what manhood was supposed to be.
Right.
So, and that was one of the things that after a while I started, when more and more of the feminist rhetoric started coming into clinical work and treatment, and the toxic hegemonic masculinity and all these things about what manhood was, as though its nature were broken. I started to question, wait a minute, that isn't what my experience on the ground tells me. My experience on the ground tells me that men that hit their wives, if you can build enough of a rapport with them to get them to really be honest about who they are and what they feel terrible about it. They don't feel privileged into beating their wives. They feel like they have failed because they lost control, because they damaged somebody that was weaker than them. That is what I found in the actual practice. And so the treatment goal at that point was, in a sense, to get them reconnected with their sense of masculinity so that they could feel a sense of pride again. And so when people come around talking about that we need to change what it means to be a man, I'm like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Are you absolutely out of your mind?
Yes.
Because if you change what it means to become a man, then what you're saying is that we want manhood to be something other than protector. And if you're going in that direction, I'm going to tell you the result is not going to be good.
It won't be pretty.
Nope.
Can we talk a little bit about the whiteribbon.org site?
Sure.
That's critical to let people know about, and I think it's an important story.
It's an important story, and more importantly, Tom, it's a funny story. And we like funny stories.
We love funny stories.
First of all, let me encourage everybody to visit whiteribbon.org. That is a website owned by A Voice for Men, where you will see interviews with Marty Feibert, with Murray Strauss, with Don Dutton, where you will see talks with Aaron Pitsey, where you will see article after article after article after interview that really paints the honest picture of what domestic violence is and what possible solutions are, and importantly, who it impacts the most. Because after all, the whole idea of trying to address social problems is hopefully to relieve pain rather than make money. What I noticed in critiquing whiteribbon.org, or the White Ribbon's campaigns of Australia and the UK and Canada, and in all the disinformation putting out there that is being put out there, we stumbled upon the fact, one, that White Ribbon was not a trademarked brand in the United States, and that the domains for whiteribbon.org and whiteribboncampaign.org were available. It is a uniquely Australian, Canadian, UK thing. There's no program that we knew of in America, so ADFM bought the domains and built a website and put it out there, which I'm proud to do. There has been lots of noise. I've been getting calls from the Sydney Morning Herald and seeing my name in not so complimentary print. But here's the deal. We're going to tell the truth in any way we can. When we talked about Murray Strauss's paper, we weren't kidding to say that there is, and you don't have to put on a tinfoil hat to know it, there is systematic suppression of evidence results from the domestic violence industry. There is systematic disinformation being put out there all the time. And the White Ribbon campaigns of Australia, of the UK, and Canada are part of that disinformation. That is not to say that there aren't some very well-intentioned individuals involved there. And certainly it's a very, at least ostensibly, noble idea to say, I'm going to end violence against women. But the fact of the matter is just like we've said here 4 or 5 times, the domestic violence paradigm that we operate under creates more victims and perpetrators. It does not alleviate the problem of domestic violence. It creates more perpetrators and more victims, and it does not offer solutions. So what we did was I'm in the United States, we started our own White Ribbon. There's been White Ribbon used for 150 years for different campaigns throughout history. It is not something that somebody gets to own, unless you can own a word like bumblebee. But go visit whiteribbon.org and see what we have there. There's not quote-unquote men's rights literature there. None of that stuff. This is all about just delivering the honest research results. One thing I want to tack on there is at the masthead, there is an item that says research that leads to Marty Feibert's annotated bibliography. Keep in mind that that bibliography has a sample size of over 371,000 people, and all these empirical studies and surveys all pointing in the same direction. Intimate partner violence is a learned generational problem that gets passed down from parent to child, generation after generation and after generation. And if we're going to intervene in that terrible cycle, we're going to have to start telling the truth about the nature of the problem, and we're going to have to start exploring solutions like Warren's model for communication that come in and intervene in the middle of the problem. What most people won't you'll never hear from another White Ribbon campaign. There is direct links between substance abuse and domestic violence. There's direct links between being undereducated and domestic violence. There's direct links between poverty and domestic violence. You take all these factors, these are the causes of domestic violence that is a learned behavior. These are the real reasons. It's not masculinity. That is an insane snake oil sales pitch about what domestic violence is, and it's causing harm. So whether or not people agree or disagree with the Voice for Men or the men's movement or any of that, I really encourage them to go take a look at the data. Don't listen to me. Don't listen to Dr. Farrell or Tom Golden. Go look at what the world's foremost experts on domestic violence, who have dedicated lifetimes of research to understanding this problem, look at what they're telling you and ask yourself if pinning a white ribbon on your lapel and saying you'll never hit a woman is the answer to that problem. Because as long as people think that is the answer, we're going to have a very, very difficult time getting to any solutions.
Good.
I love whiteribbon.org. I absolutely love it. Every time I go there, it makes me smile. Every time I think about it, it makes me smile, because it loves both men and women. I mean, what a concept. So bless you, Paul. Thank you very much for doing that.
Yes.
What do you got to say?
That is really a big gift. And let me verify something that, or illustrate something I think that Paul said that is so important. People can say, well, maybe the poor thing, that's really not, that's just poor people are like this. It's not poor people that are like this. Let's look at the situation of Flint, Michigan. Flint, Michigan had, when it was the center of the automaking business, and almost everybody in the city was employed. It had one of the lowest levels of domestic violence and the lowest levels of rape of any significant city in the United States. But then General Motors had to let about, I think it was 100,000 or so men and women go, mostly men. And within 5 years after that, it had one of the highest rape rates and highest domestic violence rates of any place in the of any city in the country. So here we have the same human population, the same demographic, the same education. The only difference is people without a job who are now feeling powerlessness, not powerful. These were people who lost male, quote, male privilege of having an income and status in the community. Without that, the domestic violence rate and the rape rate soared, because domestic violence is a momentary act of power that emanates from a deep experience of powerlessness. It's when people feel powerless that they lose control and they become somebody they don't want to be, and a man becomes somebody he doesn't want to be. So now let's take the next level of that. There's an entire nation that has an infrastructure of shelters. So let's say a man is unemployed and he's feeling really down and he's starting to drink, and the man and woman together, get into some type of physical violence. Now, if they do that, the only shelters that are available are shelters for women. Let's say there's children at home. Why should the woman be discriminated against and be the one forced to leave the home and go into a shelter? Why should it not be a mutual decision that either the man or the woman should go into the shelter and the other one could be at home? So our attitude that only women can be the victim often is the attitude that forces the woman out of the home and leaves the man in the home. Well, that's not fair to women, and it's differently not fair to men. And so the unintended consequences that often come back to hurt women are not even looked at. But the most important unintended consequences is when that woman goes into that shelter, she learns to leave the man, which means breaking apart the mother and father from the family. That family is often the father is often separated from the children. The children are often without the father. So we've done huge amounts of damage out of a small amount of damage, as opposed to learning how to repair, as opposed to learning how to use the shelter system as a system to give us a signal to have really good people there that help that couple communicate effectively, both as a family and as a husband and wife. That's what will keep our family together. That's what will keep love together. The feminist model in this about domestic violence is the sickest, most destructive model to the family, to men and to women.
That's a nice quote, Warren. I like that. I've seen it over and over again.
Yes, it's really those of us that work in in communication, know that we've done such a tremendous injustice, leaving that solution basically out of the core feminist model.
Yes.
And if we don't do something about it, I can tell you that it can get worse. I don't know if either of you gentlemen are familiar with the New York model. It's one of the things that hinted at by the NOMAS and I believe also AMSA. And that is, it takes the Duluth model, it's like the Duluth model on crack.
Oh, God.
And the assertion of the New York model is that not only is domestic violence overwhelmingly male and based in patriarchal power, but it's also untreatable, and that the only remedy is incarceration.
Right.
That you can't bother talking to these guys, you just got to lock them all up.
Yes.
This is scary stuff for people that have hundreds of millions of dollars to spread information and to influence policy and to affect law in this country. This is why, another reason, because eventually, not that it hasn't already happened, it becomes a civil liberties issue. What do we do? Accusation, no matter what, we deny, just like, again, Google Denise Hines and her research on what happens to men who look for help in our system. We deny male victims, we overstate female victims, and then we translate that into laws that negatively impact people for the rest of their lives. This is a civil liberties issue as much as it is a social issue.
Yeah, it's very. Mark Angelucci is doing good work out in California on trying to sue to prevent this type of thing from being able to continue occurring. People who aren't aware of this should be aware that the Violence Against Women Act has been misused to protect women without protecting women, meaning that it protects women on the surface, like we've been talking about, but it's hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer money being used to perpetuate the type of New York and Duluth model that we're talking about, that all men who engage in domestic violence are perpetrators who need to be put in prison or can't or have no possibility of being repaired, and women who engage in domestic violence, oh, they don't exist, or there's a reason for it. And so this is very, very deeply an enormous misuse of our monies on a moral level, and it's a great misuse of our monies on a legal level as well. And so it's really something that if you care about it, and especially if you have a child that's young and she or he wants to get into an area that is meaningful, as many young people fortunately do, this is an area to train yourself in and to become an exception to the rule in. Social work schools are almost completely staffed by feminist women, and a small percentage of mostly gay male teachers that are very anti-male. And so be somebody who's an exception to the rule, like Jack Kammer at the University of Maryland, who went into social work to become an exception to the rule in the social work model, and has had an impact there in helping to sort of get the social work model to be a little bit aware of itself. So there's an enormous potential for sense of purpose in a young woman or young man who wants to enter into this field and be a spokesperson for both sexes rather than a spokesperson for men as oppressors and women as oppressed.
Indeed. Yeah, the New York model that you're both talking about makes me think that they're believing that all men are sociopaths. I mean, that's yes. The assumption there, which is just hard to believe. I mean, it's just.
I think you can find that strewn throughout feminist literature for the past 40 years.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Well, I think to be fair on that statement, Tom, it would be any man who does something like this is fundamentally a sociopath. The second you hit a woman, then you're put into that category, and there can be no nuance about this. And the sad thing is that we have all these women's studies programs at the top universities, and they all take this Marxist, feminist, patriarchal, men as oppressors, women as oppressed positions, and so anyone who wants to enter into the field of gender is basically thrown out if they don't believe this. And so it's going to take people of courage to reverse this process. And you, Paul, and I, and many of us that have gotten our death threats. But it takes people that say, if you need to, kill me, but I'm here for the process of making this world better in this type of way of understanding that both men and women are filled with flaws, and we're filled with the desire to also love.
Yeah, well said.
Very well said.
Are we getting close to the end?
I think we should probably, yes, we should probably keep this to an hour so we don't scare people away from interviewing us to begin with.
A little late.
Yeah, we'll try to be here on time next time.
Yeah, we'll do our best.
Well, I
It's not Paul's fault anyway.
It was not your fault. It was the.
Oh gosh. Any last words then?
Yeah, I got something.
Go.
To reiterate what I think is the real importance of this, where people think, okay, this is a academic discussion, and that a bunch of arm's-length social justice people are going to look at this and try to do something, and MRAs are going to try to do their thing. Consider this. Elizabeth Sheehy, professor of law at the University of Ottawa, published a book just several months ago to some critical acclaim, where she asserted that not only did women who felt like they were being abused in their marriages or relationships have a right to kill their husbands, they have a moral obligation to. Now get the distinction of what I'm saying here. She is printing literature out of a major university, a professor of law, telling women that they're morally obligated to kill their abusers. And she says, quite literally, it doesn't matter if they're asleep in bed or passed out. None of this matters. If you get a chance, you are to kill them. Folks, is this the world you want your children to grow up in? I mean, it's a simple question. And if it's not, it's time to do more than just sit around and talk about it. There are many initiatives out there now that are trying to get, AVFM is one of them, the work Warren Farrell and Tom Golden have been doing for decades, and others are trying to get some sort of rational discourse going on about domestic violence. We just had a conference at the Kennesaw State University where this subject came up. And it was a great conference, and it is certainly possible to get this stuff on the table, because the truth doesn't like being in the dark too long, especially if there are men and women with some fortitude behind it to stand up and assert it. But this stuff is getting really crazy. When we're talking about, you use words like moral obligation to kill people, I think of 1936 Berlin. I'm sorry for invoking Godwin's law, but that's what I think of, that kind of thinking. And men are being so demonized and so marginalized in terms of their problems, and now we have university professors advocating their death. Yeah. This is a sad time in our history. It really is. And there are people do need to stand up and speak about this.
An example of that, I think, also, Paul, is in Dallas. We had the Dallas Area Rapid Transit had posters that were put on the buses of the Dallas Area Rapid Transit. And one of them said, "When I grow up, I will beat my wife." This was a picture of a white male boy, like an 11-year-old boy, who said, "When I grow up, I will beat my wife." That's a huge poster on the Dallas Area Rapid Transit. And they had one for girls, too. The one for girls says, "One day my husband will kill me." Picture of a black girl saying, "One day my husband will kill me." Now, the importance of this, as with Elizabeth Sheehy, is not that a person has said this. It was a little bit off the rocker. With Elizabeth Sheehy, it's that a major university is supporting this. And in Dallas, that the Dallas Area Rapid Transit funded this, and then hundreds of people put these. It went through the bureaucracy of Dallas, and hundreds of people put these things up on posters up, and they lasted for quite a while before they were taken down. Think of the layers of bureaucracy through which one has to go, and the embedded prejudice against men that would allow posters like that to go up on a public transit like the Dallas Area Rapid Transit. That's the degree to which this sexism, this hatred of men, is embedded in the culture. And anyone who considers yourself a humanist, remember that that men are part of that human process.
Indeed. And thank you, Warren, and thank you, Paul, for a very potent way of looking at how bad things have gotten, really, with the she-he example and with the Dallas example. And I guess I'd like to end just by saying men are good.
And don't forget, there is no I in team in MANstream.
Thank you, Paul. There's no I in MANstream, and we will look forward to seeing you next week and every week, promptly at 7 o'clock. Thank you all.